In this video, I will explain the purpose of the FIRPTA form and how you can easily prepare this form to meet any broker checklist requirement for paperwork. For some reason, agents do not like this form, but it's actually really easy and very important, so I'll explain. So the FIRPTA FIRPTA stands for Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. And basically, and actually, it shows you here. Now, here's the important distinction. This is why this whole form is so important. The FIRPTA determines whether or not the seller is a foreign person or entity subject to a tax withholding. Here's why it's important for the buyer. Because the buyer, let's see, Internal Revenue Code provides that a transferee buyer of U.S. real property must withhold tax if the seller is a foreign person. Okay. Is it possible that the seller could be a foreign person? Absolutely. That's not rare at all in California. What if they don't pay the tax? Well, the buyer is on the hook for it. And I'll explain the nightmare I went through with the IRS in the past. But this form, let me explain how to fill it out very quickly. You're going to put the property address here in 2A. The transferor's name, transferor being seller. And then, is there an exemption? Or is the seller a foreign person subject to a tax withholding in escrow? And this whole form is where they're creating an affidavit saying, I'm not a foreign person, therefore not subject to withholding. So all this seller needs to do is their address, their name, check the box of their exemption for their particular status. They need to write their social security number or tax ID. Sometimes it's a foreign entity. And a telephone number would be nice. Actually, so social, address, and telephone number, all these are very important. I'll explain why, because I've gone through this. I've gone down the rabbit hole of when things go wrong with the FIRPTA. And then the seller signs. The seller signing that this is an affidavit. I'm not subject to this withholding. Here's my info. Okay, and now this thing's 2 pages. It gives you all sorts of text, and there's an initial portion at the bottom. But that's it. That's how simple this can be. But people do this wrong all the time. I see this all the time. It drives me nuts. 5A, the seller doesn't put their social because they think the buyer is going to just steal their identity, I guess. I don't know. It's nonsense. But that's okay. If people are highly concerned about their privacy, there's a workaround, and I'm going to show you right now. But before I show you the workaround, this form without this info in section 5 is useless. And I see this on files where people submit the FIRPTA and the seller signs, but they don't fill this part out, or they might fill their address out but not that, or something like that. And I see buyers sign this sometimes. What the buyer doesn't know is that they're signing on for a major tax bill if anything goes wrong. So if this is not filled out right here, this form's unacceptable 100%. It's useless. So here's the workaround. Qualified substitute. This is where someone says they have an affidavit on file. This is the affidavit, car form AS. QS is the workaround. And it basically identifies the property up here. Who's a qualified substitute? Almost always it's the company conducting escrow, because escrow gets an affidavit on file. So escrow is going to have their own version of the FIRPTA. The FIRPTA is the affidavit. It's that simple. Escrow is going to have their own version. And so the escrow will put their name here, we're ABC escrow or title. And then they'll put the name of the transfer. That's the seller, the party transferring property. And then the seller, escrow is a qualified substitute. They're qualified to substitute as showing that they have possession of the affidavit. So they're putting their name here, escrow officer's name. Escrow officer is going to sign here because this is now an affidavit that the affidavit exists, that escrow is in possession of it. And then the buyer is going to acknowledge it. That's all you need. So at our company, we only require this form, the QS, qualified substitute form, or an AS. That's it. That's all we require. And it's very important, and I'll tell you why. So we had an instance, this was a few years ago, and the seller was I don't know if they're a foreign person or entity, but either way, they were subject to the withholding, and the IRS was never paid. And there was a large tax bill. This was a 7-figure sales price property. There was a large tax bill owed. Guess who was on the hook? The buyer. Because the way the law is written is it puts the burden on the buyer. It says, hey, buyer, you're responsible, so you find it out. I know it sounds crazy because no buyer knows what they're going into, but this is why the buyer's signing off. The first thing the IRS asked me for was, what information do you have here? I mean, and they were like probing for any information I had on the seller. The IRS, they're holding the buyer accountable, but they're still going to go after the seller for all this. If you don't have a social or a tax ID and you're like, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm just a buyer. I thought the seller was local. I didn't know he or she or whatever was from another country or was moving back to Canada or whatever the circumstances. The IRS doesn't care. They're going to say, what's the tax ID? I don't have it. It's your obligation, because this is your ticket to getting out of a complete mess if the seller does not pay the withholding tax. Because if the buyer can't produce this and say, we collected all of this in good faith, we have a signed affidavit by the seller and all of their tax ID information, there you go, IRS, leave me alone. That's a radically different response than I don't have it. I'm sorry. It was an incomplete form and I signed it. And they're going to say, okay, well, no problem, because the code provides that you're responsible, buyer that has never met the seller before. Do you understand how crazy that sounds? All this can be avoided very simply. This Form AS must be done, or the qualified substitute in its place. It's that simple, and there should be no compromise in terms of the data that's on here being complete. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.